Welcome to my webinar on a kind way to approach loss and grieving. I want to put a lot of emphasis on the second word, kind, because I think when we think about loss and grieving, grieving is such a hard topic to talk about. It's like death. We just can't talk about it. But we all experience it. It's absolutely universal. Sooner or later in our lives, we experience loss, we experience failure or disappointment, and we grieve that. And sometimes the situation is very important to us, and the grieving is very strong, very intense experience, and it's a painful experience. It hurts, and so we tend to shrink from it. And it can be debilitating, as you well know, and probably many of you have had, if not in your own experience, have had family members or close friends who were in grief for a very long period of time, and maybe even had, a hard time performing normal activities like working or socializing or just taking care of business in their lives. And so grieving can be a very significant thing in our lives. And it's one of those topics. I haven't talked about it much in the past, but I wanted to put some attention on it. And part of the reason I wanted to put attention on it is that I saw an article, and the article said, well, there are these 5 stages of grieving, but so-and-so has a different way of looking at grieving. And he came up with a list of tasks. And I read the tasks over and I thought, these aren't really tasks. These aren't things you do to deal with grieving. This is the goal of dealing with grieving, is how to come out of grieving, or that is what it looks like to come out of grieving. And so I thought, I could present something here that I think actually would shed some useful light on the topic and maybe offer some really concrete ways and very easy ways that people can themselves utilize to manage or approach their grieving process and move it along, so that they're not suffering. Now, that is not to say that we should get rid of grieving, and it's very important, like all other feelings, and you've heard me say this for at least 2 or 3 years now, that it's not that we want to get rid of the feeling of grieving. It's that we want to reduce the energy that's wrapped up in that to a level that we would call manageable or comfortable. And so we want to be kind to ourselves. And that's why I put that word there, a kind way, because we want to be kind to ourselves as we approach grieving so that we can live our lives and feel good about where we are at. And, I'm going to make a comment here about psychotherapy. And, generally, I think it's a very slow process. And I think that because psychotherapy keeps often bringing people back into their painful feelings, it creates a situation that is not kind to ourselves. We're not being kind to ourselves as we go through that process necessarily. And some psychotherapists kind of push people, to be in touch with their grief and work their way through it. And it becomes a very cognitive process. And yet they're feeling that in here, and it's really very, very uncomfortable. So this is a kind way of going about it. So let's think a little bit about grieving. First of all, grieving is a reaction to a situation. And thus it must be distinguished from clinical depression, which is an intense and prolonged feeling of sadness accompanied by helplessness and hopelessness. And there's a whole bunch of other characteristics, and I'll go over those a little bit later. But I want to make a distinction right off so that we don't get confused, that grieving is a process that's a reaction to something that has happened to us. And, what is it that we grieve? Loss, failure, and disappointment primarily. A loss typically is of a person or an object, or in this pandemic, a loss of a job, feeling, and the accompanying feeling of unproductive, and also the loss of income. And that can occur whether we're having a pandemic or not, of course. But when we lose our means of livelihood, that really hurts. And it's not just the financial problem, it's the feeling we get. Oh, I've lost or I've failed in my job. Maybe I got fired because, I just wasn't doing well in the job. And, we may say things to ourselves like, oh, I didn't like the job anyway. I should have quit or found another job a long time ago. But now, we're here in this situation. So we have that, that loss of income and that feeling of being unproductive. And most of us need to feel productive every day, even, that you get up in the morning and you do things and you feel like I launched my day, and you go off either to work or whatever else activities you have planned. And you feel like I've done something, my day is productive. But in this pandemic, we have other losses. The loss of childcare, for one thing, is in school. So that for a lot of us, there's been a pressure, that, oh my God, I got this kid I have to take care of that I wasn't expecting to have to take care of. And that's expensive. And, maybe I can't do that. Now, some people got lucky. Maybe they were able to work at home and so they could be with their kids. And, there are endless jokes about, kids running around in the background while mother or father is on a Zoom call with their boss in their work environment. And, they get photobombed all the time, interrupted by the kids wanting things and so on and so forth. One of the things that happens in the pandemic is loss of routine. A lot of people had a hard time getting up at a good time in the morning and going to bed at a good time at night. It often seemed not to really matter. Plus, you got that extra time you weren't commuting to work. So, it's like, oh, I can goof off more. And I still find myself rationalizing sometimes staying up late by, well, it doesn't really matter. And yet it does. And of course, I have a meditation routine, which pretty much anchors my day to a time schedule. So that helps a great deal, but not everybody has that. A lot of people are feeling unsafe, really insecure in this pandemic. I'm not just talking about financial security here, but the sense of if I'm not really vigilant, I could get sick. And I know people that basically have completely isolated themselves. They have their food delivered to their home if they can afford it. But I know people that are doing that, and they just basically never go out. And they may have some valid reasons for that. There may be health concerns, underlying conditions that would make them at greater risk if they got sick. But there's a feeling that goes with that is like, I'm not safe here. The world is not a safe place now. And then there are, of course, the usual social influences that can create to a lack of feeling of being unsafe in your community. And then, of course, we've all experienced, I think, a loss of community and togetherness. And I know right now I see a lot of people who are out very casually, not taking measures of social distancing and masking and stuff. And the main reason they're doing it, they may have a lot of thoughts in their mind about why they do it, but the main reason is they just want to be with people in a normal, what they call a normal way. And sometimes they look at me because I'm the only one wearing a mask and they go like, look at that guy, but I'm the exception that proves the rule, that the people they need social contact. And so the loss of social contact through social distancing and masking and everything is very difficult. And that's true for children too, children who are not in school because there's COVID in the classroom and they've closed the classroom where they were just trying to prevent it. So, there are those kinds of reasons. And then, of course, we go through these same kinds of things unrelated to COVID, just if we have an injury or an illness, some other illness, particularly if we have a chronic condition, like we get cancer or we have an inflammatory condition or one of those many things, that keeps us at home. And that can cut us off from social contact and physical contact with people. And I think a lot of people, from what I've heard of, and myself too, found it very difficult never to hug anybody. I went almost a year without physically touching another person except my granddaughter. And that was just weird. I finally actually had gotten used to that. I have to say that it's something you can get past, but it's not easy. It's not easy to get past that because this is a basic human need for contact. So we go through those things related to loss. Failure can occur in marriage or social relationships of any kind, job, recreation, things that we just don't succeed in doing, and that really disturb us, and that we wind up grieving that, I really blew that. I didn't do well in that, and I lost that. So failure is another category of things that can trigger grieving. And then finally, disappointment, and I'm thinking mostly of other people when I say that. It's being let down or rejected by others, but we can also be disappointed in ourselves, of course. Then that can go with a failure or with a loss, and I didn't say goodbye to that person. I should have had some contact with them, or I should have done something. And so we feel down about ourselves while we're feeling the loss, perhaps. So these things can be mixed, right? They're not necessarily separate. The loss, failure, or disappointment. So those are very basic things. Wow, 15 minutes have gone by and I'm still in the introduction. Why do we grieve? I think this is a very important idea. And I'm absolutely shocked to find that what I'm going to call the public literature really doesn't say very much about why we grieve. It's like we grieve because of loss, failure, or disappointment, but that doesn't actually say why we grieve. It just says that we do that in reaction to those things. But why? Grieving is a reaction to one of those, and it's basically so we feel that the experience is meaningful, because without grief, any experience of loss, failure, or disappointment seems trivial, right? If we don't have some sense of the pain and go through that process, it feels like it's of no importance. And you might say it's our body or mind's way of communicating to us it matters. This person mattered to us, this situation mattered to us, what I lost or where I failed or the disappointment I experienced, it matters to me. And if we think of it that way, it kind of changes our attitude about grieving, right? It's not just now a reaction and I got to get through this process. It's, I need to acknowledge to myself, I need to feel that this was important. And it's sort of something we take for granted, but not something we necessarily really put attention on and experience and appreciate within ourselves. That the grieving process itself is our signal. It's our body's way of telling us, and our mind too. But it's a physical thing. We feel it in our body. Now, it's a process, grieving, and there are steps, and those steps have been around, I think, for almost 50 years. And those steps, I'll just name them here and then kind of talk about them in some detail. So the steps are denial and isolation. Denial is that, well, first of all, the initial experience of a loss, particularly a surprised catastrophic loss, is shock, right? Sometimes a person's been ill for a long time and then they pass, and then we just go right into that process that, they're gone, and then we feel that. By the way, these steps are not necessarily sequential, and some of them occur concomitantly, and sometimes they go back and forth between them. So it's important just to kind of remember that. Isolation is a thing that happens, so that when we grieve, we tend to literally, physically contract, and we also emotionally contract in terms of being able to relate to the outside world. We cut ourselves off from the world by that process. And I actually said that in a way I didn't really want to, because it denotes blame. It's not that we do it because like, oh, I'm cutting myself off. It's like it just happens, right? We just feel that. It's like the feelings inside are so intense that we're completely absorbed in those feelings. And at that time, probably don't have an awful lot of empathy for others. If we have close family, particularly children, we may, younger children particularly, but even at any age, we may be able to relate to their experience some, but empathy usually at that point is fairly low. And we're really into our own process. So that first step of in that, often in a state of shock, that we have a denial. And denial is a weird thing because it's illogical, right? We intellectually know, but we try to imagine that it isn't really so. This didn't really happen. And you have to have gone through that and seen it in order to kind of believe that people do that, but they really do it. It's one of the initial reactions, and it occurs right in that shock stage. Typically, it didn't happen. And the funny thing is, you can talk to somebody and they'll say, "Well, yeah, my father died," but inside he's still here. I saw a demonstration of that. It was fictional, but it probably was based on something real. And that was a girl, a college age student, was sending her father text messages after he had passed. He didn't get any answers, of course, just sending out text messages as a way of staying in contact, a way of saying, you were a person I could communicate with and needed to communicate with and still need to communicate with. And, it's painful for me that you're gone, and I'm going to so it's a kind of denial. It's like intellectually, the character in the movie knew the father was gone, but emotionally, there was still that denial. And this was fairly soon after the father had passed. So denial and isolation are the first ones. And then typically anger comes. And that anger can be directed even at the person that died. How could you do that to me? How could you abandon me like that? And that's, of course, that can come about easily if you really were abandoned, right? If you lost a relationship and that person left, particularly if you stayed where the two of you were living and then they moved out, right? And you go like, you're really angry at them. But you can be angry at God. You can be angry at people who try to be helpful and tell you to move on and it's okay. And, they're in a better place. The person who passed away or had to go off to do something else, if it's a relationship thing, or if it's a job, it's like, they'll say to you, well, that wasn't really a good job for you. Or, I know it's better that you move on. And you're going like, you get real, I'm not going to do it. I was going to act it out. And I said, no, I'm not going to do it. But, you feel angry. You feel frustrated with the situation. Third stage is bargaining. And bargaining is an interesting thing. Bargaining is trying to make a deal with God or with yourself or some part of yourself or with others, maybe even friends, that, well, I'll change my behavior and then everything will be okay. So you can bargain with God, well, I'll be a good person and, the relationship will either be restored or, I'll be forgiven and I won't be sent off to a hot place and so on and so forth. So bargaining, and it doesn't happen in every situation, in every grieving process, but bargaining is a common thing. And it's a completely in your head kind of thing, or in one's head, that you're telling yourself a story about what happened and what you did or didn't do and how you're going to change that. And you're making a deal, hopefully with God, maybe with the devil, who knows, that it's going to be different. So it's a very much in your own head kind of thing. And then you kind of run out of steam and you slip into a state which everybody calls depression, but it's actually a state of sadness. And the reason is that there's a clinical state of depression. They look very much alike, but the context is different. And so we slip into a state where we're feeling very, very sad. And we may not want to get up in the morning. We may have no energy during the day. We may avoid friends and social contacts. We don't want to go out. We don't want to do stuff. Many times people can't even make their food. They really can't take care of themselves very well. And a lot of times that's where you see a friend come in and kind of, clean the house and make some food or take them out or just hang out with them. And that depressed state, that sad state, can last a really long time. And in certain situations, particularly when a parent loses a child, that sadness really never goes away. It gets better, meaning it ceases to be so omnipresent and so oppressive, typically, but it's always there. And little things may set it off. Seeing another person with their kid, particularly if the kid is the age that your child was when they passed. And the child doesn't have to be a small child. I remember, to give a personal example, I remember when my father passed, my grandmother, his mother, was just devastated. And to the end of her life, and she lived 99 years, which was a long time after my father passed, to the end of her life, any thought of my father, any thought of birthday or, a situation where he might have, spoken or spoken up or said something, she felt sad. She could feel that. So that never really went away. So those kind of situations often persist. And so it gets manageable usually, but still it's there. There's this underlying thing. And it should also be noted that if a person has in the past had tendencies to depression, clinical depression, the grieving may intermix with that and such that the grieving looks more permanent, but what is actually going on is the person is depressed and they may need help managing depression. And that will be a little bit different than the process of managing grief. And sometimes you'll do both, right? You'll work on the grief, but you also work on the depression. And then the last stage is acceptance. And acceptance is it's a very special kind of state. And it's not necessarily the end of the process of grieving, but in this stage, we accept the fact of the loss or failure or disappointment. We accept that it has occurred and that we can't change what happened. And accepting that we can't change it, right? Because in bargaining, we're trying to change it, right? Accepting that we can't change it is very, very important. Now, we may have tender feelings that persist, and they get triggered, as I said before, by anniversaries or seeing a similar situation with others, or just, as I say, if it was a child seeing another person's child at about the same age, and particularly if they were doing something your child liked to do, that kind of thing can re-trigger those feelings. But fundamentally, we accept that we've had this loss or this disappointment or this failure. In this state of acceptance, we're no longer paralyzed by our sadness. We can live our lives more or less fully. I have to say more or less, because for some people, they really are doing just fine. Other people, it still kind of lingers in a way that maybe makes us very hesitant to go and involved in another relationship. Or there's that sense, particularly if you've lost a child, and in my grandmother's case, an adult child, um, irreplaceable. There is no replacing that. Interesting, I had another experience of grieving with the same grandmother. I remember very clearly when I was probably in middle school that her best friend passed away. And she had had that best friend at that point for about a half a century. It was that long. And I remember having the thought, I didn't really talk to her about it, and I wish I had, but I remember having the thought that there was no way I could comprehend the significance to her of the loss of a best friend of 50 years. Just let that soak in for a second. We try to be empathetic with people, but there are some things we really cannot comprehend. And the loss of a long-term relationship, the loss of a child, we can kind of comprehend the loss of a parent because most of us have at least some experience, if not a parent, a grandparent. So we have some knowledge of that experience. But, I remember when my mother's mother passed, my mother was really upset. And I remember thinking about, why is she so upset? Grandmother was pretty old. She passed painlessly. It was sudden, but, she didn't suffer. It didn't seem to me to be such a terrible thing. I could kind of go like, yeah, I'll miss her, but, I wasn't so close to her. And I was watching my mother go through this and realizing my mother had a lot of very strong feelings of love and attachment to her mother. And so that was a little hard for me to understand, but, I could at least process that to a degree. But some of these other situations, just beyond comprehension. Well, I need to keep moving along here because we've already gone half an hour and I'm only halfway through this. I'll try to be brief. So I want to talk a little bit about those tasks. And I see them more as goals, but the tasks are: accept the reality of the loss, experience the pain, which really means open yourself to that experience, which can be excruciating and very difficult to do. Adjust to the absence of the deceased. That is definitely a goal. Adjust. That process of adjustment is completely different than the goal of being adjusted. And then the final one is find an enduring connection. And that actually is something, the goal is the enduring connection. And the process of that is simply asking, what is it from that person? What did I get from them? That is so significant. Let me give you just a little bit more then about these tasks or goals. The first one addresses the first stage of grieving, which is the shock and the denial. It's important to remember that the initial reaction is shock, and which there's denial and confusion. It's really disorienting, and it's like the ground is shaking or the rug is pulled out from under you. And the denial is often expressed in a single word, particularly if it is a sudden event. It's no. And confusion can be expressed as a question without an answer. What will I do now? There are a lot of different ways that question can come out. There are a lot of different questions, but it's like, what do I do? What do I do now? And to get on to what we can do, because as I said, these are goals, and it's like, how do we reach the goals? And one of them in this stage is to sit still, like I did at the beginning of this webinar. Sit still, collect yourself. And then that phrase that I've used so often over the last few years, something, you can even put your hand on it if it's on your chest or your abdomen, maybe up in your throat. Something inside me is feeling shocked and it is denying what happened. Just name it like that. You know, that part that says no, it's inside me and it's denying what happened. It's shocked. This language, as I've said so many times, creates some space between ourself and our experience. And it's very, very important that we do that. It helps us to become a witness of our experience. I'm feeling shocked. I'm denying, I'm saying no about what happened. So this is in this first part of the experience. In that witnessing of the experience is the possibility for transformation from shock to acceptance of the reality of the situation. It happened and that's okay. I can deal with that. Goal 2 addresses the anger, bargaining, and depression, right? Because goal 2 is experience the pain. So anger, of course, is a defense against pain and the bargaining that we're going through and the sadness that we're feeling. And these ensure that the reality of loss sinks in and we process the loss. We can approach these emotions in the same way we approach shock by saying something inside me feels and then name it. We will likely have to use this approach again and again as new feelings emerge: anger, guilt, sadness, loneliness, longing, all of these things. When we say to ourselves something inside me instead of I feel, we open the door to a broader perspective and genuine transformation. As a witness of our experience, I feel something. That's me, feels. There's some space there between I and that. If I say I feel, then we're caught up in that. But if I say something inside me feels, then we're talking to some part within me. The third and fourth goal, adjusting to the absences of the deceased and finding, or whatever is lost or failed, and the last one is find enduring connection. They help us develop a true and lasting acceptance. We adjust to the absence of the loved one. Sometimes we say love object because it doesn't have to be a person. Or sometimes we refer to people as objects, but that's a whole other thing. You know, I mean, it may be literally an object. Your house burns down, you lose your possessions. That's a huge shock to the system. And we can grieve, oh, I lost all of these things that were part of my life. And so that's, you know, so we can lose an object. And of course, gradually we will create a new life that does not contain what we lost. There are many ways of getting on with our life, but it's easier to get on if we develop a sense of enduring connection. For me, it's knowing what I gained and keep from having had a relationship, whatever that was, even if it was a job. You know, as a lot of people have asked me if I minded retiring from the practice of medicine. And I said, no, I feel very fulfilled in what I did as a physician. Which is not to say I didn't make any mistakes, but you know, I feel very good about what I did as a physician. And so I carry that with me. I have an enduring connection with my history as a physician. And so I feel completely comfortable and I don't miss it a bit. Keeping sentimental objects may serve to remind us of what we had, but ultimately we have to become aware of what we still have. Now, what that means is, I'll use a personal example again. I still have my father's cigarette box. It's silver, has a special wood lining, and I don't remember what the wood is. And the idea was it would keep cigarettes from drying out. And my father was a pack a day smoker. And so he would go through many of the cigarettes each day and have to refill the thing very frequently. And it's a beautiful case. And I kept that, even though smoking killed him. He got lung cancer, but I keep it not thinking of that, but of thinking of his fondness for this case. And so it gives me an enduring connection to my father. It's like he touched that, I touch it. There's a connection there. I'm touching him. Rational? No, but it's an emotional thing, and it does help. One of the things we may have taken away is a greater capacity to love and appreciate what we have instead of what we don't have. And I think about my paternal grandmother that way, the one I keep talking about, who lived to be 99. When I think of her, I think of what I got from her, because I was very close to her. And it was a very special relationship. And I still have that. I don't have her, but I have the sense of the relationship. So having engaged in all these tasks and achieved these goals does not mean that we will forget those that we love or that we cease to feel grief, particularly at another time of loss. And so oftentimes when we lose something else that's similar, someone else that's similar, we feel those feelings again. But pining for whom and what was lost ceases to dominate our lives. So we stop wallowing in our misery. We move on. We've learned to accept reality and the feelings that accompany loss. And we've learned how to move on with our lives. And I think it's very important as we step away from this that we remember that there are many ways to get support. And I'm certainly here to help those who are grieving when that process does not seem to be moving along well or is just so intense that we can scarcely bear it. But we can be with friends and be supportive of friends. And I'm going to go through there are 7 of these that I've found listed out in the world, in cyberspace. And I think they're very interesting. One is be present. And I often suggest to people, don't ask, are you all right, when you can see that they're not. The best thing you can do in many situations, particularly right after the loss has occurred or the failure, the disappointment, whatever has happened, the best thing you can do is just physically be present. Some people want to be touched, others do not. You can kind of just check that out. Do they want you to hold their hand or put your arm around them? Do they want you to hug them and cuddle them and maybe even just let them cry on your shoulder? But the best thing is to show up, talk less, and listen more. And you can take that to complete extreme, and that is say nothing, because you really don't need to. The person, by your presence, knows that you care. And if they talk, listen, but don't try to get them to talk. They may just need to be inward at that time, and that's fine. That's a perfectly good thing. Second one is be comfortable with another's pain. Be comfortable with another's pain, meaning don't be frightened by somebody's pain, the intense sadness that they're experiencing. If you have so much sadness within you that you can't handle it, you're not going to be very useful to that person. So be comfortable with their pain and don't try to change it. I said that very slowly, deliberately. Don't try to change it. It's not your job. I'm letting that sink in. Just be with it. Just be with it. They're hurting. And you can repeat back to them. If they say, oh, it hurts so much, you say, yes, it hurts so much. But you don't try to change it. We often give people rationalizations or excuses, or, it'll be all right, or they're there, don't cry. Yeah, they need to cry. Let them cry. It's a good thing. Third one, avoid giving advice. Everyone experiences grief differently, and it's their process, not yours. Don't give them advice. Even if they ask for it many times, it's best not to tell them what to do, or even what you see is best. That's something you have to kind of measure depending on your relationship with the person and the situation. But generally, you don't give them advice about the grieving. Now, they may ask your advice about, well, how do I make funeral arrangements? And you go like, okay, I can help you with that. That's practical stuff, and that's okay. But be very careful even about advising about that. They may want a big fancy coffin, very expensive. And you're feeling maybe, you really don't have the money for that. But, if you're going to suggest that they be more conservative in their spending, that's very delicate. So be careful about giving advice. Be careful to say things that are objective and true and are not judgmental. And I just gave you an example. You may have the judgment that they can't really afford an expensive casket, but the only thing you can say is that casket costs so much, this much. This is what the price tag is, and that's a true statement. Don't use words like expensive. That's a judgment. That's a judgment. It's hard to think about these things sometimes. But it is expensive. Well, yes, but it's a judgment because it's relative to something else that is less expensive. The objective statement is how much it costs. Stick to the truth, or all things that are true. And again, as I suggested earlier, this is the fifth one, make concrete offers to help, or just help with basics like food and cleaning. You don't always have to ask, although it's usually a good idea. Pardon me. But if you offer to help, make it concrete, and then, of course, make sure that you do it if they agree to have you do it. So if you say, well, I'll take care of the flowers, then take care of the flowers. You really don't want to fail them at this time, because that kind of thing really hurts. Because then because they're in that state, they're going to go like, you failed me. So, if you offer to do something, then do it. The sixth one then is that although sadness is normal, depression is not. And you can check out the differences online. And I may put the link in my follow-up letter just so everybody can have that. But sadness is normal, and we don't try to take that away from them. Depression is a clinical state, and they may need some professional help, or possibly my help, to deal with that. And again, as I said earlier, if a person has a history of depression, any loss or failure or disappointment may be especially difficult to manage. And finally, if people are wallowing, if your friend is wallowing, recommend getting help. Recommend getting help. It's okay to say that. And you can say, I'm happy to be with you. I love you and I want to be with you and support you. But I think you need some help processing this grief because you're just wallowing in it. And you keep telling me the same stories over and over again, and you're not getting things done that need to be attended to, and so on and so forth. But you've got to be careful not to be too critical. So let me give you some strategies for dealing with your own grief. I'm just amazed at the time, but I got into this subject and I started doing all this research, and I just really, is like, this is a big topic. It's a really, really great topic. First point is be kind to yourself. Grieving is normal. So accept that you're grieving and hurting. Accept that your mind plays and replays the situation. And oftentimes the if onlys come up. If only I had done this, if only I had done that. And then the third one is accept that your situation becomes a story about your life. And we all do that. We turn it into a story. This is the way things are. And we confuse acceptance of a reality with acceptance of this is who I am. I am this grieving person. And so on and so forth. I lived through this situation and I got all these reasons to be miserable. And by golly, I'm going to be miserable. That's condensing it into a few sentences. Second one is be present with your feelings, heartache, anger, loneliness, helplessness. Put attention on them. Sit still. Something inside me feels heartache, feels lonely, feels anger, and so on. Third one is use the inner relationship focusing strategy of settling inside and saying to yourself, and I already did this, something inside me is feeling, it feels like, and use an analogy. Many times it'll feel like my heart is being crushed. That's a good one. It's squeezed. It's in a vice, or it's squeezed between my hands like this. So, use an analogy. It feels like, and then add, and I am here with it without judgment. I am here with it without judgment. Let the part that is hurting know that you accept that it is hurting and won't try to change that. And our experience over and over, if we try to change it, it just digs in and won't change. Don't try to change it. And this takes some practice. This is a skill. When you feel connected to a part of yourself that is hurting or is angry, you might ask it if it has anything it might want to tell you. I'm going to say that again. When you feel connected to a part that is of yourself that is hurting or is angry or anything else, you might ask it if it has anything it might want to tell you. If after waiting patiently, and you do have to wait patiently, if after waiting patiently it offers nothing, you might ask if perhaps it's trying to show you how much you care. Right? Remember, we talked earlier about significance. The purpose of grieving is to show you that what you're grieving for was significant to you. So you can just ask it, perhaps you're trying to show me how much you care, how important this loss, failure, or disappointment is to you. Offer gratitude for whatever your hurting part shares with you. Offer gratitude. Because what we usually offer is resentment and resistance. I don't want to feel the pain. But if you offer gratitude, what happens is the energy dissipates. It has a chance to shift. Sit with the parts that are hurting, angry, lonely, helpless, or whatever, until you feel a shift. Now, sometimes you won't have enough time and you can just excuse yourself graciously and say, please, I need to leave. Can I come back to you later? And if they say no, then don't leave. But usually they'll say, yeah, all right, sure. They may even be a little sarcastic. At least my inner parts tend to be sarcastic. And then you can offer that gratitude. And then be mindful that you may find yourself caught up in a story about your suffering. You have to become consciously aware of that. If you find yourself telling a story, return to the beginning of the focusing process. You might say something like, are you feeling? That must feel bad. I'm here with you. Right? And so you step out of the story. This is very important. And I spend much of my counseling time helping people get out of their story. And it's a very interesting experience. I'll say it, I've said it many times. Usually when I meet with people, the first thing they want to do is launch into their story and tell me how and why they're so miserable about whatever it is, illness or whatever. And usually within 3 minutes, I know exactly what their problem is. They may not be done telling me their story, but their story isn't their problem. The problem is that they have these parts inside that they're not acknowledging, these parts that are hurting, angry, lonely, helpless, or whatever they're feeling. So sit with those parts until you feel a shift. So those are practical things that you can do on your own. Because it's gone on for almost an hour, I am not going to take questions on this here. But we will at the end of the group clearing session, which is where I work with everybody. But I'm going to end the recording here, and then we'll move on into that group clearing session. And I didn't do that right.